Okay, so I know folks will be joining in, so why don't we get started just so we start on time. Hi everyone, my name is Crystal Peck and I'm an assistant professor in gender and sexuality studies at UC Riverside. It's wonderful to see all of your faces virtually. So if you're logged in, you're here for an event, a virtual event, Feminist Framings and First Books. And I'll be in discussion with my wonderful colleagues at UC Riverside, Doctors Jade Sasser and Donatella Galella, who I will provide proper introductions in a second. So just before we start, I just want to thank the Center for Ideas and Society for helping to organize this event, and also to the Departments of Theater and Gender and Sexuality Studies for co-sponsoring this event. So just briefly, the roundtable conversation that we'll be having today really sort of engages the topic of first books and the publication of first books within the humanities and the social sciences. And we'll be sharing our approaches to the research, writing, publication process, and what it means to center a critical feminist approach and orientation to our multifaceted work. And I just want to say that, it's such an honor and privilege to be in conversation with Dr. Sasser and Galella, just as a kind of collective celebration of our books, but also to provide some space to be in conversation with each other, but with all of you as well, just about the labor-intensive process of writing a first book within academia. I think more often than not, the book itself is recognized and sort of seen, right, in its final form, so a bounded book, but all of us know that, of course, these books are much more than what is published. It's about, the years of hard work, that are full of challenges, but also collaborative conversations and camaraderie. And maybe also being in discussion with all of you of what it means to write a first book within sort of artificial timeline in some ways, in terms of being on sort of tenure track for many of us. And maybe to also emphasize that, of course, everyone's sort of first book publication process looks very differently. And then personally for me, I want to note that hopefully this can also be a starting point to have more sustained discussions on how to provide critical sort of structural support, especially for junior scholars working on their first book projects beyond sort of the, the individual fellowship model. And just creating some sustained dialogues. So just a note about Zoom etiquette. We're going to ask everyone just to mute their mics for now. And if you have questions, you can type them into the chat box function. And CIS and Catherine Henshaw, who has been so wonderful in helping us sort of organize the event, will keep a tab on the questions and we'll forward them our way so we can converse with all of you. After Doctors Galella and Sasser and myself are in conversation. So we'll have about maybe a 45 minute discussion among panelists. We were able to brainstorm some questions together, and then hopefully we'll transition into sort of a conversation with all of you in terms of the questions that you might have about book projects, book writing, and as well as sort of the individual books in and of themselves. So I want to introduce and provide a brief bio for our wonderful participants. So Dr. Donatella Galella, whose pronouns are she, her, hers, is assistant professor of theater. She's waiting here at the University of California, Riverside, UCR. She researches how capitalism and white supremacy shape and are also shaped by contemporary US theater from arena stage to Hamilton. So her current book project, her second book project, theorizes how yellowface persists in 21st century musical productions and how Asian American artists and activists counter this anti-Asian casting practice, which I think is so important, especially at this moment. And then we have Dr. Jade S. Sasser, whose pronouns are she, her, hers, who is an associate professor of gender and sexuality studies at UCR, so a colleague of mine in gender and sexuality studies. Her work explores how large-scale environmental problems such as climate change intersect with women's bodies, health rights, and reproduction. Her first book on infertile ground, population control and women's rights in the era of climate change, was published in 2018 by NYU Press, and recently won, actually this academic year, the Emory Elliott Award from Center for Ideas and Society, which recognizes first books and publications. So congratulations, Jade. And as I noted, my name is Crystal Peck. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm an assistant professor here at UC Riverside in Gender and Sexuality Studies. Very broadly, my work engages the everydayness of war and militarization, especially as it hardens or calcifies into hypervisible forms and formations that are rendered as outside of sort of the economy of war altogether. And so my first book, Re-Encounters in the Korean War and Diasporic Memory Critique, which came out in November of this past year, focuses on the lasting consequences of the still unended Korean War and how Korean diasporic cultural practitioners, through feminist and queer memory practices, challenge Cold War framings of the Korean War as a capitalist victory situated in the past. And I'll be moderating this panel and also participating. So I thought that again, we're going to segue into questions that we were able to brainstorm together collectively. So maybe I'll start with just a very broad question for Jade, Donatella, and myself. I wonder if maybe we could speak a little bit about sort of what feminist orientations and practices were actually integral to our first book in regards to the research, but also the method and writing process. So maybe we can start with Jade, if that's okay.
Yeah, so first, thank you for inviting me to be on this panel, and thank you for to everyone who is participating on this very warm day. Yeah, so I feel like a feminist framing really kind of guided everything about my project, from the initial research questions that I was asking to who I wanted my interlocutors to be, to how I went about writing the project. So my book is actually something that really challenges received wisdom and dominant prevailing paradigms in environmental studies around the significance of population growth. So I take a strong anti-Malthusian approach and argue that population growth is in fact not a main or direct linear driver of environmental degradation. And I detail the history of how those ideas were developed and the impacts that they have had on women, on communities of color, and on the poor. So from the beginning, even just conceiving of the project, my initial questions were conceptualized in a feminist intersectional way. And I knew that I wanted to foreground reproductive justice, which is an intersectional feminist social movement and framing. And also I knew that I wanted to use a critical feminist science studies approach to understanding how ecological science and ecological knowledge is developed. So all of those sort of questions were in the foreground even when I was conceptualizing the project to begin with. And I'll stop there and let Donna talk.
Great, thank you so much to my dear colleagues, Professors Peck and Sasser. And I just finished reading your book on infertile ground, and it was so terrific. So my book is called America in the Round, Capital, Race, and Nation in Washington, D.C.'s Arena Stage. So it's a critical history of the first professional regional theater in the US Capitol. So the words gender and feminism are not in my title, and my research interests really do focus on capitalism and white supremacy in contemporary American theater, as Professor Peck said. But Arena Stage was co-founded by Zelda Fitch-Handler in 1950, and she ran that theater for 40 years. And today the theater is run by Molly Smith, who has run it for the past 20 years. And she is one of, I believe, something like 14 women who run large League of Resident theaters, and there are about 70 of those across this country. So from the start, this was a project focusing on women's leadership. Then I also thought about things like I was an intern at Arena Stage, and so there are times in the book when I'm talking about my own experiences having worked at Arena and being in the audience, in particular production. So I use the I, and I acknowledge that I'm not some sort of neutral observer. There's no such thing. And I remember speaking with my colleague and friend, Professor Tammy Ho, who told me that that was okay for me to do when I had gotten some pushback in a reader report about just saying I in certain circumstances. So thinking about that in a feminist way of acknowledging my specific experience, not pretending that there's some sort of neutrality, and just thinking about my own identity here and how that relates with the power dynamics of what I was watching and how I received what I was watching. And then finally, I have another very close friend and colleague, Janet Werther, who read my manuscript and pointed out that there were many times when I cite queer theorists, but I use them to talk about racism and capitalism and not queer theory. And so that got me thinking more seriously about certain sections in my book about how patriarchy and heteronormativity really structured the plays that I analyze, and thinking through that helped me strengthen my arguments for why those plays were so appealing to liberal audiences, because a lot of my book puts forth that Arena has managed to be successful for about 70 years because they push the envelope on certain kinds of progressive racial politics, but then they rein in certain things so that they don't alienate people too much. So it's that kind of balance of getting ticket sales and awards and grants, and again, pushing the envelope, but not too far. So for instance, there was a musical version of A Raisin in the Sun, the play by Lorraine Hansberry that Arena launched, and then it went to Broadway. And in looking at earlier versions of it in the archives, I noticed that the character of Beneatha was this really strong Black feminist voice, and then they cut all of her songs from the final version except for a duet that she has with her boyfriend. So what does that mean? Versus Walter Younger really emerges as the protagonist in this show. He has the most songs, we're following his journey, and there's also a lot less of his mother, Lena. So thinking through that helped me further understand that the musical tamed the play, and that's why in the 1970s it was actually so much more successful than the play, because it reified this kind of normative Black heteromasculinity that was really desired. So that is how I would say there was this feminist approach to my book, because it's a book about women leading this theater. It's about me taking ownership of my own perspective on the theater, and then finally just thinking through how patriarchy and heteronormativity shaped the writing of and reception of various plays.
Thank you so much, Jade and Donna. So maybe briefly building on what both my colleagues offered, like Jade, sort of my training and the fields I was engaging with, I think was really important to the project in and of itself. So I was trained as an interdisciplinary scholar in gender and sexuality studies, feminist oral history, and ethnic studies. And this really shaped sort of all aspects of my research, from the kinds of questions that I was asking to the methods that I mobilized to the research and writing process in and of itself. And, sort of broadly, my first book, Re-Encounters on the Korean War, Ideas, Work, Memory, Critique, sort of thinks about this question of, what does it mean to remember a war that is literally unfinished and that continues, to the extent that, it's, so specifically I'm talking about the Korean War, and sort of thinking about the ways in which war, as it, spans across decades, becomes so enmeshed within every day that it's naturalized and normalized. So it's no longer seen or recognized as part and parcel of a sort of an economy of war. So, you know, really sort of thinking about genealogies of kinship that are linked to war and sort of multi-generational displacements that are recoded as sort of economic or educational migrations, thinking about socioeconomic apparatuses such as the transnational adoption industry in South Korea, and thinking about memory practices in and of themselves, and sort of in relationship to that, also thinking about the uneven implications for bodies that are racialized, sexualized, gendered as non-normative or as other. I think in one way, the book is really conversing with and also expanding on existing scholarship on the Korean War, especially in Asian American studies and in American studies, because it tries to delve beyond this framework of hauntings or sort of ghostly hauntings, which has really, I think, been an important paradigm within Korean War studies. So the book itself draws on sort of critical bodies of feminist literature and scholarship, especially women of color critique, queer diasporic literature, critical Asian American studies, sort of engaging with scholars like Christine Hong, Laura Kang, Grace Cho, Lisa Yoneyama, Gaiju Gopinath, but also peers, I think, who are sort of emerging scholars at the moment. You know, Monica Kim, Simeon Mann, Chuo Kim, Elizabeth Son, and Jina Kim. And sort of broadly speaking as well, the book tries to track the multiple colonialisms, US and Japanese imperialisms in particular, that really undergird the making of the Korean War. And again, how this kind of making is yoked to racial violence, white supremacy, sexual violence, and thinking about the macro relationship between Korea and the US as racialized, gendered, and sexualized. But I think in relationship to sort of the substantive research, some of the practices were really important in terms of thinking about some critical feminist practices, especially, and you know, we're sort of in an economic context where production increasingly, right, in terms of sort of quantitative sort of production of producing more articles and books has become such a focus. So sort of making sure I was grounded in a certain set of practices was really important. So thinking about difference and generosity. So what does it mean to be in dialogue with other scholars, peers, peers and established scholars alike, where I'm trying not to frame my work as sort of disrupting necessarily in literature, but maybe generatively building on existing work. So this isn't commensurate with being aligned, right, or even in agreement with existing theoretical frameworks, but just moving from a place of, again, generosity, and I can talk a little bit more about that during the Q&A, and then thinking about sort of lateral and horizontal relationality sort of in relationship, and I think in tension at times, right, with the kinds of hierarchies that are in place within academia. So trying to be in conversation with peers and colleagues and sort of thinking about what does it mean to be in sort of a practice of reciprocity, so sharing work, but also reading the work of friends and peers, and being fortunate that I think that was modeled for me by a number of mentors. And also understanding that scholarship is never written in isolation, but is always in conversation and connection with others. So for me, citational practice was something that I was really conscious of when I was writing the first book, and I actually wrote a sort of a note about it before my introduction in my book. And citational practice, of course, isn't about intellectual property, right? It's about acknowledging that the work that we're doing is really sort of always in conversation with others, especially with peers and with students. So those were some of the things that I think were really important to me. So maybe the second question that I want to ask sort of my peers is, you know, what were the origins of your projects, and who would you like to read your books? Maybe sort of thinking about audience, and maybe we can start with Donna.
Yeah, so as I had mentioned, I was an intern in the dramaturgy department at Arena Stage in the summer of 2009. And that was just because my significant other, now my spouse, lived outside of DC. I'm from New York City, so I grew up with Broadway, and I thought that was theater and that was it. So I was very snooty about theater and clueless about how it could exist professionally outside of New York. So when I decided I'll apply for internships in DC so I can be with my significant other. I landed at Arena Stage, and that first taught me about the circulation of theater between Broadway and regional theaters. Then it specifically taught me about Arena's history as being one of the progenitors of doing that way back in the 1960s. And as an intern in the dramaturgy department, one of my jobs was reading new scripts, writing evaluations, and helping to figure out what the season of programming should be. So I was really interested in what the artistic, financial, and political reasons were behind choosing one play and not another. So then I realized that there was no critical book about this theater company. Indeed, there were very, very few books about mainstream American regional theaters besides coffee table books that often the theaters themselves create for their donors. So I became interested in first researching the economics of Arena Stage. Then I was awakened by Black Lives Matter and the Occupy Wall Street movement, and that got me really interested in the special place of Black theater and audiences at Arena, both again in this liberal way of Zelda Fitzhandler recognizing that she's in a city that by 1970 was 70% Black, and yet she was not depicting those stories, those people, welcoming those audiences into her theater at that time. And so she changed what that programming was. And then by the late 80s, early 90s, she was capitalizing on diversity being this new thing that could be funded. She got a $1 million grant from the National Endowment for the Arts. And so this attempt to have inclusivity with African-American stories and African diasporic people was both a welcoming gesture for racial integration and also this money-making endeavor. So I became interested in that process. And then finally, I was an intern during the first term of President Barack Obama. So there was all this discourse, right, of hope and change. So I was interested in what that meant for a theater, also, just a few miles from the White House. And the theater at that time was rebranding itself because it used to be the only game in town in 1950. And now it competes with about 80 other professional theaters in Washington, D.C. So then they started to distinguish themselves as where American theater lives or a center for American theater. So I was curious about what does that mean? Who gets to count as American? Who doesn't? What kinds of stories can be told and what kinds still can't? And therefore, the last section of the book was more about American identity and multiracial casting for these classic American musicals, how they stage the diversity of Americanness, but still within this white frame with these classic, implicitly white traditional musicals that celebrate the United States and ignore things like settler colonialism. So I write about the musical Oklahoma. So that was the kind of journey with that project and how my interest changed, and then that shaped the book. And as for who I would like to read this book, I really wrote this for my academic colleagues as well as for patrons of Arena Stage. My dream is that a subscriber picks up the book at the gift shop and they learn more about this company that they love, but that they also develop a more critical awareness of its history and its politics, and then their own positionality for why they have such a relationship with this company.
Thanks, Donna. Jade, do you want to?
Sure. So the first thing I want to say, I want to just briefly return to question 1, because there was something that I forgot to mention, which is the importance of having a writing group. And I had a phenomenal writing group on campus. 2 of those members are here in this conversation. Hi, Chicago. Hi, Dana. It was a feminist writing group, and I think that we operated under a feminist ethic of care, which is extremely important And what I mean by that is this was a writing group where we actually read each other's work and commented on it and provided a lot of really in-depth feedback that was organized around support and care, more so than critique. Of course, we offered critical feedback, but a feminist ethic of care was built into how we operated as a group. And I don't think that I would have been able to really get from dissertation to book manuscript in the way that I was on the time frame that I did without the support of this group. So for those of you who are still writing first books, or even not writing first books, writing second or third or whatever, I strongly recommend a writing group if you're not in one. They literally read every word, which was wonderful. So the question of how this project came along. So the project is about a particular aspect or element of international development work, which is the sector of population and family planning. And the book really deeply delves into how policy advocacy and program management within that arena, how they are impacted by the environmental lobby. And, you know, a lot of scholars of international development are former development workers themselves, and I'm no exception to that rule. So before coming back to graduate school for my PhD in 2005, I worked in international development for several years. I started off as a Peace Corps volunteer, and then I worked for a public health NGO doing sexual and reproductive health work. And so from the very beginning, particularly the beginning of my time as a volunteer in Peace Corps, I always had a critical perspective. And I always felt deeply ambivalent about the work that I was doing. I felt that it was important to increase women and girls' access to sexual and reproductive health services, including access to contraception. However, I had very deep concerns about the way that that service delivery was organized, what the priority areas were, how messages were framed and delivered, and on what basis. And so I was a volunteer, Peace Corps volunteer in Madagascar, which is known as the global biodiversity hotspot. It's an ecological priority for international development. And I noticed very quickly during my volunteering time that sexual and reproductive health services were organized in places that were biodiversity and conservation hotspots. And those sexual and reproductive health services were overwhelmingly dominated by contraception and family planning. And so I just spent a lot of time saying, what is actually going on here? Like, am I actually supporting programs that were conceptualized with population control in mind? And I had a problem with it. I had a serious problem with it. And I didn't know what to do with that. So I came back after Peace Corps. I worked for an NGO, and we were doing good service delivery work, but I also on my own at that time just started reading critical academic work. I was buying all of these academic books, had no idea what the theory was about at that time. I was like, what are they talking about? But I just wanted a different language and a different kind of framework for understanding what I had done, the work that I was currently doing, and what I wanted to do in the future, because I knew that I wanted to take a critical approach, and I knew that I was interested in going back to graduate school. At that time, I didn't know that I wanted a PhD. It took a little while before I decided that that was what I wanted to do, but I started reading academic scholarship and theory on my own while I was working in that field. So by the time I was ready to come back to graduate school, I knew that I wanted to be a disruptive force in that arena. And I knew that I wanted the people who I wanted to read my book, I want everyone to read the book, especially everyone who cares about environmental issues and thinks that they know that population is a problem that needs to be solved right now. I want those people to actually read this book and understand where that set of ideas comes from, how it was developed, who developed it, under what circumstances, and why. How it does not arise from value-free or unbiased science. But I also want people who were in my specific field to read the book, and some of them have. And the book has ruffled some feathers, which is exactly what I wanted to happen. So I'm happy about that.
Yay. So maybe sort of a common theme among sort of the three of us is sort of thinking about sort of the multiple origins of the book project, how situated it is, and sort of thinking about its relationship to sort of historical, social, political moments. So, briefly, I want to note that sort of like Jade and Donna, so the origins of my book project were also multiple and situated. When I was in college, I was writing a history thesis on Korean comfort women. And Sarita C., who's part of this call, I think read almost a complete draft. So so much gratitude for her. And that's the summer before I graduated from college, from undergrad, I had interned for Kiwa, which was at that time known as Korean Immigrant Workers Advocates, a different name now. And one of the campaigns that I had been working on that summer was sort of a letter writing campaign supporting Korean comfort women who had been sort of forced into sexual labor during World War II under the Japanese Imperial Army, and sort of thinking about sort of genealogies of sort of sexual violence sort of across space and time within and across the Korean diaspora. So I would say sort of the early origins of the book project was really with my undergrad history thesis. I actually took a pretty long time off between undergrad and grad school, about 8 years. So when I sort of delved back into a PhD program, well, an oral history program originally, and then a PhD program in American Ethnic Studies at USC, I had sort of taken up pieces of sort of the history dissertation or the thesis I had written that I didn't really have a chance to explore. So thinking more broadly about the sort of multi-generational effects of Japanese US militarism, thinking more concretely about the Korean War and sort of engaging more with cultural producers. But I think the funny thing is, from the dissertation to the book, I only kept half a chapter. So the book itself was actually based on sort of new research. And there are, of course, challenges with that in terms of thinking about sort of the accelerated timeline of writing a book, within a tenure track timeline at UC Riverside. But I think the sort of other answer, and so sort of a more difficult answer, I was trying to think about sort of the project in terms of both, while writing it and then the aftermath is, I think that the project is a deeply personal one for me. My parents really grew up under a military dictatorship in Korea, as well as sort of my other family, and was deeply impacted by the division of the Korean Peninsula. There were just a lot of questions and fragments that I was not able to piece together through those kinds of personal relationships within my family, not being able to ask certain questions about family members who have been disappeared, or why we hadn't gone back to Korea after immigrating to the US, for 20 years almost. Or, both of my sisters, traveled to North Korea within the past 10 years because our family, part of our family is there, and not really understanding or having a deep knowledge of why my parents were, so the sort of sentiments that they were sharing, as well as like the deeply anti-communist sort of sentiments that I had sort of grown up with, sort of within my nuclear family, but also sort of broader communities. So I think in one way, the origins of the book project was really in relationship to that. And, I was really fortunate to have both of my sisters contribute to the book project in different ways. My twin sister actually wrote a poem for the book, which is included as part of the conclusion, and my older sister created the artwork for the book cover, which is sort of a remediated or remediated work based on a photograph of my mother when she grew up under the military dictatorship in Korea. So I'm still sort of thinking about the multiple origins of the book, and again, finding myself surprised at sort of thinking about these sort of endearing questions that I've had. So maybe we can have one additional question, and I want to make sure that we have enough time also for Q&A with all of you. So I would encourage you, if you do have questions, please feel free to use the chat function. Catherine is actually helping us collect some of the questions. So we'd love to be in conversation with all of you. I love this question. And so the question is, you know, if you could have written any book project on your subject, and not necessarily for tenure and not to meet sort of professional expectations, but, you know, writing a book that you wanted to write, how would your book be different and how would it be the same? So I love that question. So Jade, maybe we can start with you.
So I've been thinking about that a lot because I'm actually now writing that book as my second book. And the thing is this, I enjoy my first book. I'm glad that I wrote it, but I felt all of this weight and pressure to get tenure. Meaning I felt like, okay, I have to speak to these concerns in my field. I need to make an intervention, an important scholarly intervention, or something that can feel like an important scholarly intervention. And I have to really sort of deeply involve myself in these big debates, which are very important debates, but to be honest with you, the subject matter that I was researching and writing about for my first book is so politically fraught. There is so much controversy and tension at all times. Like, you cannot broach the subject of population or population growth without it being contentious. And spending all of those years on my dissertation in that tense space, and then spending all of the years to write the book in that tense space, like, it wore me down to a certain extent. And I got to a point where I just was not enjoying writing that book anymore. And at a certain point, I was like, I can't wait for this to be over so I can not be mired in controversy all the time. So the book that I am now writing it's a book that actually is on very, very closely related subjects, but from a different lens. So this book is about how people are thinking about their childbearing, their intentions to have children or to not have children in the context of climate change. So how do things like ecological anxiety, ecological grief, you know, anticipatory grief, how do those things shape people's thinking, their intentions, their decisions around whether or not to reproduce? So this book, it follows directly from the first book, but the first book is about this really large scale structural stuff: politics, policy advocacy, international, international development, program management, this long history of population control, this long history of the development of ecological knowledge around population. All of that was in the first book. And the second book is really about, how does that land on individual people? Like, how does all of that stuff come together and shape how I, the individual who is deeply concerned and terrified really about climate change, how does it land on how I think about what kinds of futures are possible, what kind of legacy I can leave in the world, and specifically what kind of human legacy, if there is any at all. So I could say that I wished I had been able to write this kind of book the first time, but that's not true. I'm glad I wrote the first book as I did, but I'm really having a good time with book number 2, except for the fact that I have to say, all of this COVID stuff, it's like really dovetailing and intersecting with everything that I'm reading for the second book. So I'm like mired in all of this anticipatory grief stuff. and it's really, 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 really heavy. And it feels very, very relevant, but it's like what had been, you know, very interesting scholarly question has now become like a, oh my God, this is like, this makes sense. This is about, do you reproduce when there's an existential threat literally plaguing the planet? Like, how do you even think about legacy or how life goes on for future generations? So I'm glad that COVID has made the research more salient in this moment, but it's really scary too.
Donna, did you want to share?
Yeah, first, I totally hear what you're saying. So for me, I think I wrote the book that I wanted to write, and a lot of that was in thanks to my series editor, Heather Nathans, who made it as strong as it could be. But I think the one thing I wish I could have changed, even as I understand like why I had to make those changes, was that I feel frustrated and resentful whenever I have to be nicer about racism. So I received some feedback on how it sounded like I was being too critical of Arena Stage at times, and I had to emphasize that they weren't being intentionally anti-Black. It was just the result of these actions, and it's just annoying to me that I would even have to talk about intentionality and just navigate white fragility, because I wasn't even being that mean. I was pointing out things like the land on which the theater sits in Southwest DC in the mid 20th century. It mostly consisted of like shacks, and it was mostly very poor African Americans who lived there. And then the Southwest Development Agency raised almost all of those buildings and kicked out almost all of those residents, and then developed and repackaged and sold that land to other entities like Arena Stage at a lower price, because then at that point Arena Stage became a nonprofit institution. So pointing that out to me is like, that's just history. That's what happened. But some people felt alienated, I guess, by the way that I talked about that. And so I had to soften the way I framed it to say, it's not like the theater deliberately kicked out these poorer African American families, but that is what happened. And then it's not like they welcomed these residents who were pushed out for many, many years. I mean, they didn't have a project. They had like a Southwest project in collaboration with residents east of the Anacostia River, not until the early 90s, and they created this Christmas carol story called A Community Carol, and they had amateurs like children and older folks come and act in the show, and they gave out free tickets. But that was also a really tense project that happened. So, you know, in an ideal world, I wouldn't have to be so gentle about my phrasing of some things. But on the other hand, I do understand that if I do have that kind of gentle wording, maybe that makes people listen more deeply or more willing to hear what it is that I'm saying. So that would be one change I would like to have made, but I also understand why I didn't do it.
Thank you so much, Donna and Jade. So I think for me, I'm really happy with the book that was published, but I think you know, when I transitioned into UCR from grad school, it was a really accelerated timeline, and you know, time just practically was it produced a lot of stress. So sort of making decisions in terms of what could be included and what could be included, what couldn't. I did have additional chapters that I did want to add around sort of the demilitarized zone and oceanic life, but I was able to fold those components sort of into the existing chapters. So again, sort of practically speaking, I think if there had been more time, there would have been probably additional chapters to the book. But I was thinking a lot also about sort of the genre of sort of academic writing. And, you know, I remember, Donna, we were in a writing group, actually supported by CIS. And, you know, I think so much of the book, the chapter draft that you had read had so many sort of endnotes and sort of citations and making sure I was citing sort of established scholars or whatnot. So being really cognizant of sort of the work that I was building on. And I think that was important to me, but also I think looking back on the project, I wish that there were also ways that I had had more sort of confidence in terms of what I was writing and not having to feel like I needed to sort of cite every sort of scholar, right, or author. That was hard for me. I still struggle with that, to be totally honest. I think also, you know, I just started sort of the second book project, and it's still, you know, I'm still sort of in the conceptualization phase, but, you know, I have been sort of shifting to sort of creative nonfiction writing. And, you know, I think with the first book, what was funny is, I really did want to create, sort of incorporate more creative nonfiction within the book, but I didn't really know how to do that. So for the conclusion of my book, it is experimental writing, and I framed it more as an opening rather than a conclusion to the book. I mean, partly because the Korean War is one that continues. And so sort of thinking about ending the book with, you know, critical questions as a form of memory and practices as well was important to me. And what was funny was when I first sent out my book for review with the press that I was working with, Temple University Press, and the review came back, you know, one of the peer readers really didn't want me to include the more experimental piece, even though it was a conclusion to the book, right? And felt like it was sort of at odds with the rest of the manuscript. So that, of course, made me want to include it more and sort of having me think more about sort of how we organize academic books, right? As sort of having a sort of linearity in terms of introduction, sort of its chapters and conclusion, and sort of trying to think a little bit more about what is the work that conclusions or introductions are supposed to do, right? So maybe sort of in the second book, thinking a little bit more about sort of the academic book as a particular genre, and maybe sort of queering that and destabilizing that. And there are so many scholars who do that as well already. So I've been sort of reading sort of a range of books, and then maybe also thinking about, and this is more of a query that I think I will continue to have with all of you, with colleagues, is sort of thinking about the life of a book beyond sort of the final publication. I mean, on the one hand, I think it's so important in terms of having books as sort of a final publication, as something that was written at a very specific historical, social, political moment, and being able to return to that, you know, sort of throughout time and space, but also sort of what would it mean to be able to have the book expand in different ways, right? So like maybe there's a digital archive that's included with the book, where, you know, authors can return to the book and have conversations with interlocutors, or if there's a cultural archive that's associated with the book, how might that expand? Because even now, like the way that I'm thinking about the first book is already changing and shifting in terms of the kinds of questions I'm asking. So I think overall, I was just thinking a lot about sort of the book as a form and genre. So with that said, maybe what we could do is segue into some questions. So I'm just reading some questions that that all of you have sent in. So the first question is specifically for Jade, and it's about your writing group. So the question is if you can expand maybe on the specifics of what care and support looks like within the praxis of your writing group. What are helpful ways to provide critical feedback as more than a kind of layperson reader when you are not versed in the fields and the conversations that your colleagues are specializing in, which is a great question.
That is a great question. So our group, so there were 4 of us and the 3 of them had already been a writing group, and then I came along and was invited in as the 4th member. And I have to also add, I was the only junior member. So part of the ethic of care I felt that was built in from the beginning was these 3 tenured faculty inviting me in to participate in their group when all of them had published a first book already and I had not, and I didn't even know some of the basic things about what should go into a preface versus an introduction versus a chapter 1. Like, they were really very helpful in pointing out just basic kinds of structure things, and also giving me feedback that I didn't get from my editor. And I know that we'll talk about editors later. I saw a question in the chat about editors. For me, the feminist sort of ethic of care showed up in that we all came together to help each other advance our projects in the best possible way that they could advance. And I think we all sort of recognize that the best way to do that is not necessarily through critique, but through rather supportive, helpful ideas and expansions that are designed to help a project thrive. I mean, I know this is very general, but I came out of a graduate program that was all about critique, right? So at that particular institution, when you get together in a group of people and you're reading someone else's work, all you're doing is pointing out the flaws in it. And that was not the case with this writing group. In fact, I found that, I don't know, I'm trying to think of very specific ways because I'm being very vague and general here, but I felt that, so for example, one of the people in the group was a historian and I had a history chapter that needed some help. And what that person did, rather than pointing out all the flaws with my way of talking about history, was they gave a really helpful overview of how historians think about history and how historians really sort of present a way of dealing with this question of change over time, how to tell a story of change over time and how to make that relevant to the present moment. Discussions like that, it was very helpful. It was extremely helpful. Thank you, Dana. And I think that, so the question was also about disciplinary difference, because we did have disciplinary differences, but instead of using those differences as a basis for critique or pointing out the problems or flaws with work, we use those differences as a way of sharing information and providing insight into how our own disciplinary backgrounds could help the person make their project stronger, both by letting them understand how someone else would read that work, but also how, you know, if you're engaging with a discipline that's different from your own, like history, for example, this is a helpful way to do it. So I don't know, I personally believe in the power of writing groups, and there are different kinds. There are some that are butts in chairs group. You just show up, put your butt in a chair and write, and you don't share the content of what you've written, but it's an accountability group that requires you to be there and to write for a certain amount of time, to always show up consistently. I think that's really important. But having a content group like this, where we each get to know each other's project soup to nuts, I think is also extremely important too. And I don't think I could have finished that project in the same way without simultaneously having both, and both were different. So this group was a content group, and then I had a separate butts and chairs group that never read the content, but that was equally important for me.
Thanks, Jade. That's really helpful. So maybe I will ask, the second question that came in through the chat function is, How much time did it take? And were there any fallouts with editors or presses? What is the editor relationship like? And I'm sure there's a whole range of answers. Donna, did you want to start?
Yeah, super quickly. So I wrote my book quite quickly. From the dissertation defense to publication was 4 years. And that's because I just made myself revise and go to archives and conduct more interviews and read more, like in a timely fashion. And I held myself to that with my accountability group of other colleagues. And my relationship with my editor, she was quite supportive. She also had warned me at the start that she was a micromanager, and I didn't know what that meant until I got my manuscript back. She gave me comments, maybe like 2 pages of comments the first time she read it, and then after revisions, and after I responded also to reader reports, there were like several rounds of these edits. She then gave me back my whole manuscript at the same time that I got the manuscript back with copy edits. And she had commented on almost every single page, and this was about 350 pages. So I was given about 3 weeks to attend to both my editor's comments and to address all the copy edits. That was extremely stressful, and that was due to miscommunication between the people at the University of Iowa Press. So again, she was supportive. It was pretty quick, but the end part was very stressful, and they made it seem like, I don't know, like no one really apologized, and I just had to hammer it out at the end.
Wow, I did not know that, Donna, actually. Jade, did you want to share with the press?
Yeah, so I started off, my process took a little bit longer than Donatella's. So from the time I graduated and finished my PhD till the time the book was published, it was 6 years. Partly because I started off with a tenure track job at a different university that was more teaching heavy, so I basically had no time to write other than in the summer. The other thing though is I had started off with another press as part of a series. I went in as part of a series proposal, and there was a person who, she was sort of the gatekeeper and our liaison to the press, so we never actually interacted directly with the editor at the press. We interacted with our special issue series person. Anyway, she heavily micromanaged my proposal and initial chapters that I was trying to submit, to the point where it became so difficult to work with her as a gatekeeper that I had to leave that press. And when I say it was difficult, I mean, she was like line editing in red ink, and wordsmithing, and really actually coining new phrases and like changing some of the meaningful substantive content of what I was writing. And I was like, this person doesn't fully get what I'm trying to do, and she's trying to make her own interventions via my project. And so A, it's gonna slow me down, and B, this is not gonna produce the book that I want. So I left, went with another press. When I went with that other press, NYU Press, things went very, very quickly. I would say though that things happen at different presses, so just be aware. The acquisitions editor who I came in with, she left during the time that my book was, in progress. So I went from one editor to another. That first editor was very hands-on, read very closely. We were in frequent communication. The second one, less so. So just know that things happen sometimes with publishers, and that can slow you down or speed you up or whatever, but just know that it's not necessarily always going to be a smooth ride from the day you get, a contract to the day that the book comes out.
That's really helpful too, Jade. So maybe just quickly adding, so I think in terms of what both Donna and Jade shared, sort of in thinking about presses, I think it's so important to know, I mean, of course, in terms of going with the press that you feel like is sort of well situated within the fields that you're in conversation with, but also knowing the process, the publication process, and sort of the acquisition process, the timeline. And I think for me, I was in conversation with multiple presses, but I think sort of my relationship with my editor really, it was really the relationship that I had with my editor that made me select the press that I eventually went with. She was really interested in the project, was really supportive, but was also really frank in providing very concrete feedback. She did not sugarcoat things, and we're good friends now. Sarah Cohen, she started with Temple as acquisitions editor, is now with University of Michigan Press. I'm in American Studies, but she was amazing. I mean, she, I think in part, she really knew sort of the timeline that I was working with, so was so supportive, was, you know, responded to all my emails within, I would say within a few hours that we were in communication, at least within sort of the initial acquisition phase. So that really made a big difference for me in terms of both the interests of Temple University Press and sort of my relationship with Sarah, sort of her willingness to even sort of when the writing wasn't going very well, she was always so encouraging. And I think just had a really great balance of not micromanaging, but giving sort of critical feedback in ways that I felt like that resonated with me. And also, you know, in sort of our conversations, I think there was a lot of space to sort of talk about what I wanted to include in the book. So I remember when I received the readers' reports, and when the reports was really, you know, loved the book as a whole, but really hated the conclusion and really didn't want me to include the conclusion, and had actually mentioned in the letter that it would impact my tenure. And you know, that felt awful, but, you know, after talking to some mentors that I really trust, and also talking to Sarah, like, she was just very encouraging and was really supportive when I want to go ahead and sort of move, you know, with the book as it was. So I think for me, the relationship with my editor, at least for this first book, was really important. Yeah, so are there other questions that folks have for panelists, or questions for for each other, or if especially for junior scholars who are working on their first books? Are there any questions, comments? Okay, so I'm going to read a comment from Sarita. Sarita C. So across all three of your books, it's clear that these were deliberately conceived of and designed as productive disruptions in your fields and disciplines. At the same time, each of the books are both timely and relevant, as well as have a head gravity to them that reminds me powerfully of the difference between journalism and academic scholarship. Yes. In other words, there's a durational and endurance dimension to this that resonates with all academics, but perhaps particularly with women of color faculty. How has this experience shaped your pedagogy in relation to your students and advisees? Oh, that's such a great question, Sarita. Did anyone, Donna or Jade, do you want to take up that question?
I feel like I need a minute to
I know, it's a deep question.
That's a good question. Yeah. Yeah, I think a lot about what it means to be a teacher scholar, and meaning how I bring not just my own scholarship into the classroom in terms of whether I assign my own work on the syllabus, but I think a lot about my research methodology in how I teach students. So I teach a research methods course. And the course focuses on qualitative research and from a feminist perspective. And so, you know, we use a lot of very critical, disruptive texts that talk about what it means to do feminist research. But even aside from that research methods class, how has this experience shaped your pedagogy in relation to your students and advisees? It's such an important question. I think that it really shapes a lot of my discussions with students about what constitutes research, because a lot of students come into the classroom with a set of ideas, and then I spend the rest of the quarter disrupting and dismantling those ideas, because feminist research from a feminist science and technology studies perspective really requires you to critically interrogate the basic fundamental process of knowledge production. How is knowledge produced? Under what circumstances? What are the politics of how knowledge is produced? What are the ways in which culture fully shapes those processes? Not to mention just culture, but also social inequality, patriarchy, misogyny, etc., racism. And so that is a fundamental part of the way that I approach my pedagogy. And I don't always directly link it to theory. I'm always looking for ways to make those ideas more approachable and accessible for students. But I do somewhat regularly bring in the process of writing a book into the discussion, particularly in the research methods class, so that students can understand that doing critical qualitative research work is important and can make an important intervention into a field, and that research is not always quantitative. It is not value free. It is not based on some sort of mythical state in which there are not biases that shape how you produce your knowledge, all of that. So I go through that, and then I actually go through it, how this book came about, with those understandings in mind.
Somewhat similarly for me, I think a lot about epistemology and power when I teach, and especially being out here in Riverside, I now have students who have not necessarily seen a show in New York City before, but their access to theater has been in schools and in community theater and regional theater. So on the first day of class, when I ask them, what's your favorite play? We then track what are the patterns in their answers, and they're typically classic plays by white men. Or in my African American drama class, I'll ask, what's your favorite Black play, and what does the word Black play mean? And most students don't have an answer because they've actually never read one, and almost all of them have never seen one professionally produced. So then that opens up questions of, why are those their favorite plays? How did they encounter those plays in the first place? Who makes the decisions behind programming at your school, in your syllabus, and at your local professional theater? And what don't you know about, and why is that the case? So that is a starting point for a lot of my classes. And I also teach a course in history of musical theater, and Arena Stage specializes in musicals. That's what makes the most money at the theater, and they often have multiracial casts in these classic golden age shows that often celebrate like white American identity and heteronormative marriages at the end of the show. So my students tend to love musicals at the start, and I play the feminist killjoy, so I ruin the musicals for them. And then now they're ruined, and now they can't unsee how the musicals often replicate power hierarchies. And then I have to bring them back into the realm of pleasure and teach them it's okay for you to love this and to enjoy this, but we also have to view this critically and see how it operates with power. So that is something that was really solidified for me when writing the book, and therefore trying to teach that out when I have those classes with Riverside students.
Thanks so much, Donna and Jade. So just maybe briefly adding to that, I think along with sort of thinking about epistemology, sort of power, sort of interdisciplinary scholarship, I think, and primarily I'm talking about sort of working with graduate students, is that, you know, I think something that was really important for me in grad school, but also more so just in terms of writing the book, especially the first 2 years of writing it, it was just so important to be in conversation with peers, with other junior scholars who were sort of also thinking about, or sort of were aligned with certain questions I was asking about, and again, sort of thinking about sort of reciprocity. So, you know, sharing work, but also reading work, being in sort of constructive conversation. And, you know, when I think about it in grad school, it was really not until my last year, one seminar that I took, that I didn't really read other students' work. It was in this one seminar where I had a chance to read what my peers were actually writing. And I learned so much from that process, not just in terms of what they were writing, but the processes in which you know, they wrote. So as part of this, you know, final seminar in grad school, we actually had to talk about how we were writing, from the schedule that we were writing in, and some of the challenges that we were facing. So I think for my grad students at UC Riverside, it is really important for me to sort of create a space for them to be in conversation with each other. So sort of through writing groups, or just even through sort of regular check-ins with them, whether or not I'm sort of advising them directly. I think the other note that comes to mind, I think this is very much in dialogue with both Jade and Donna, sort of thinking about what is interdisciplinary scholarship. So, you know, I think at times, you know, I've been in part of conversations at various conferences. I remember going to this oral history conference last fall, and where sort of this notion of interdisciplinary scholars, just sort of reading through and engaging with different disciplines, which of course is not, you know, the point of interdisciplinary scholarship, is sort of thinking about and really challenging the disciplining of disciplines, right? So sort of bringing that, I think, into the conversations that I'm having with students. And then I think, you know, the last point I want to make is really thinking about, again, this is in conversation with what Jade and Donna shared, is thinking about the sort of historical, political, social moment that we're in, and also sort of the institution that we're embedded in, sort of neoliberal university in context. And, you know, especially at Riverside, what does it mean to be writing a dissertation when you're TAing, you know, classes, and, you know, have over 100 students? You know, what does it mean to be doing this work with so much sort of labor and precarity? And how does that then sort of shape the ways in which I'm providing support to students? So, you know, it can be, you know, I've literally had so many conversations with students about literally thinking about sort of how do we schedule in sort of 30-minute, 15-minute writing chunks, or sort of brainstorming chunks, right? So again, thinking about the particular spaces that they're a part of, the moment that we're all in right now. And we can talk, I'm sure we can have a whole conversation around, you know, precarity and the university, especially at this moment, but that's been really important for me. So let's see, there are 2 more questions, and maybe what I'll do, just because we have 15 minutes, so let me just read this question. So one question is, thank you so much for the helpful and valuable talks. Could you please talk more about writing groups? I wonder how you joined these groups. Did you know the other group members? Were the members in your discipline? And until when did the group continue? And I think that's specifically for Jade. And how did you choose and decide a publisher for all of us? So I think Jade might have answered some of those questions, but Jade, did you want to just share everything?
So I found the group the group existed before I came along, and they invited me in. And the reason why they invited me is because there was a member of my department whose work overlaps with mine in certain ways. And I told her I needed a writing group, and she invited me to join. I recognize that that's not necessarily something that all new assistant professors have the opportunity to do, but I would say whenever you can, band together with other junior faculty or whoever it is that you're making connections with, and ask if they would like to form a writing group. So for me, the sort of culture of writing groups is something that was deeply ingrained with me from graduate school. My department in grad school, we had what were called lab groups, but not science lab groups. These were writing discussion groups where we would workshop someone's work every week, everyone who worked with my advisor. So we were a writing group. And then aside from that lab group, I had a writing group, content-based writing group, where we shared our work with each other. And that was how I finished my dissertation, was working with a writing group in grad school. So coming out of grad school, I knew that writing groups were extremely important and that I would make an effort to always have them. So when I came out of grad school, I immediately formed a different writing group with 3 other people who had just finished their PhDs too, to start looking at turning our dissertations into book manuscripts. Over time, that group wasn't quite as helpful. That was sort of winding down when I first got to UCR, which was when I started saying I need another writing group, and then I was invited to join one. The Butts in Chairs group, there are plenty of junior faculty at UCR who do butts in chairs writing. I know I keep using that phrase, but you know what I mean, write on site, show up and write, just show up, start the timer and write. I think just ask around. CIS sponsors a number of groups. But really, if there are other people who are currently working on books, whether they're first books or 10th books, if they're willing to form a writing group, or if you're just willing to ask them, someone will say yes. Someone needs accountability. Someone needs someone to read their content. The question of interdisciplinarity, we were coming from different disciplines, but we were all doing interdisciplinary work that linked or overlapped enough that we could understand each other's work, even if we didn't have all of the inside knowledge of all of the specific terms or theoretical framings. And I think that that's important too, because not everyone who reads your book will be in your discipline. So your book needs to be legible and accessible to scholars and other informed people from backgrounds that are completely different from yours. So I think it's actually really important to have a writing group that is not filled with members of your own discipline.
Donna, did you want to add to that at all in terms of writing groups or writing process?
I didn't have a writing group, so no, I didn't think that was.
Well, we were in conversation actually.
We were.
That was for a very
That's for the second book that.
Oh, okay.
That with you, and I think it's I think part of it was I felt comfortable with my project, but maybe I was also scared to share it with other people. I also just wanted to get it done quickly. I'll say that my spouse though read everything, and I talked to him about everything I was writing always, and I still do that now. And that was really, really helpful just to verbally articulate and then get it down and to get feedback from him. So the rest of the question, deciding on the publisher, I wanted to go with a university press because I was told that's what I was supposed to do in order to get tenure, which I'm still waiting for. And Crystal knows. And I chose the University of Iowa Press because they had a series on studies in theater history and culture that was quite esteemed, and because of the series editor, who was someone who was an African Americanist, so she knew what I was talking about in my book, and she had worked at the University of Maryland, College Park for many years, so she even knew what the theater company was that I was talking about. I remember when I approached a different university press at a conference once, the acquisition editor was like, oh, that sounds interesting. You should make each chapter a different theater in the round. Or like a different theater in Washington, D.C. And it was clear to me that this person didn't know what company I was talking about. So that was a red flag for me. So for me, it was really about finding a press that would be legible as prestigious for my tenure file, and finding an editor who was the right fit, who I knew my subject matter and who would support me.
Jade, did you want to say anything about press? I mean, you said a little bit about how you went with NYU Press, but did you want to add anything to that, the selection of the press?
I think, no, mine was a really specific and unique case. So I don't think that my experience could be generalizable beyond me.
So I think similarly to Donna, sort of the acquisitions editor that I had met with Temple University Press was really interested in the project, had worked with sort of scholars working on the Korean War, and we just clicked. So I think that was really helpful. And also Temple has one of the oldest Asian American Studies, culture and history series, academic series. So I think that was really important. I mean, some of it was also, to be honest, about timeline. I mean, I think there were certain presses I was really interested in sort of being in conversation with, but they just had a very different review process that would have just taken much longer. And for me, I felt a lot of pressure. And I know some of you know this because I was in conversation with some of you about this, but you know, that was definitely sort of a practical a factor. So maybe a combination in terms of selecting presses, a press that is quote unquote recognized in my field, but also sort of, and also my relationship with the editor, the acquisitions editor in particular, and then sort of the sort of pragmatics of timeline in terms of the review process was really important for me. I mean, I started actually the book process pretty late compared to other colleagues, so I really felt like at that time I was in the weeds. But you know, luckily everything worked out, and I'm really happy with the book. But yeah, at that time it was definitely stressful. So, are there any last questions that folks have or comments? You know, I mean, my hope again, and you know, maybe this is a conversation that we can continue to have with CIS. Is, you know, I know CIS has done a really wonderful job in sort of providing sort of fellowships and sort of writing groups and reading groups on campus. And maybe sort of building on that, we can sort of think about how do we provide sort of more support, sort of systemic support for scholars writing books in general, but especially first books. I think would be really important to have, whether, you know, it's sort of continuing supporting sort of writing groups, or, you know, having conversations with different press editors or so forth. And I know there are sort of different models and paradigms that different schools have also sort of worked with in terms of supporting junior scholars. So maybe continuing that conversation would be really great on campus. So thank you so much for joining us on this very hot summer-like day. It was so wonderful to be in conversation with both Jade and Donna, but also just to see all of your very lovely faces. Now I live in Los Angeles and I commute to Riverside, and I would never, you know, I think when quarantine started, I was just like, oh, I guess I don't have to drive to Riverside, and I don't know if I'm, you know, I'm glad that I don't have to commute, but, you know, I do really miss seeing folks and people. I miss seeing, you know, I'm joking with Brandon Robinson, who's a colleague in my department, and we carpool. So I was just like, oh, I really miss our carpool conversations. But thank you so much. Have a wonderful Thursday and Friday and weekend, and hopefully we'll see each other soon. And let us know if you have other questions. You guys can also email us.
Yeah, please do.
Thank you, everyone.
Great. Thank you so much, Crystal and Jade. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Bye, thanks everyone.